say hello one by one. We'll maybe start with Susan. Do you want to just check all your mics working and levels are okay?
Hello, I'm Susan McCallum, blueberry breeder, softfruit researcher, James Hutton Institute based in Dundee, and I'm here to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Susan. Next up, we've got Louise, who needs to lean in a little bit to our microphone if the last question was anything to go by.
Hello, I'm Louise Campbell. I'm working on a Honeyberry ATP project. Hopefully you can hear me quite clearly.
That's good now, yes. Dorota, are you there? I can see you.
Hello, I'm Dorota Jarrett. I'm Blackcurrant breeder and researcher at the James Hutton Limited.
And Nikki, are you there?
Hello, I'm Nikki Jennings. I work on raspberry and blackberry breeding here at James Hutton Limited.
Okie doke. Now we're at 14:02. We still have, let me see, not a massive number of people online yet. Maybe give it one more minute. Do any of the early birds who are online already want to start testing the Q&A function by typing something into the Q&A panel on the right-hand side? I can see Harriet Duncalf, Philip Towler, Craig Davis, and a few others from the Hutton. Anybody want to give the Q&A panel a test out? I should still say that I think Dylan's still here and maybe available for questions on that project too. Yeah, that's good. Okay, while we're waiting, I think I'll make a start with one of the questions that we received early in the week, and that was from Martin Johnson of Border Berries. It's quite a lengthy question. I'll read this out. He asks, as a traditional grower of raspberries, we've been devastated by Phytophthora across all varieties, and so Glen Moore, that's the new variety from James Hutton Limited, might prove to be the way ahead for us. In your presentation, Nikki, you said that Glen Moore had been grown by you in ground known to have Phytophthora present, to which other varieties had succumbed. How long a period have the Glen Moore canes survived so far? In Martin's experience, he says new planted cane of any variety can often show initial vigour, but succumb after a year or two. Nikki.
Yeah, that's unfortunately true. Thank you, Martin, for your question. Well, the short answer is that we have had Glen Moore in infested soil for 6 years, and that was over 5 fruiting seasons, which is much longer than we usually keep breeding plots in for. We planted it in soil that we knew was infested, but it wasn't deliberately infested. We planted it in ground that had previously had raspberries, but it was about 15 years prior to that, and we knew there was some Phytophthora dotted about in patches. Also, it was planted in a plot that was below some older raspberries that was already showing symptoms that was slightly downslope from that. And Glen Moore was planted in a plot with in 2 reps of 5 plant plots alongside around 35 other genotypes, and it was in one 100-metre bay of tunnel. We started seeing symptoms after about a year, just at the start of the first season in a few of the genotypes. And then in season 2 and season 4, the plot was actually flooded during the fruit season in heavy rains, where the water just washed down from the top of the slope right through the older raspberries with symptoms into that plot. And we started seeing symptoms very quickly in many of the genotypes. But in Glen Moore, it remained symptomless in both reps. So at that point, we thought it was less likely to be avoiding Phytophthora and more likely to be showing quite a bit of tolerance or resistance to the disease. And we knew at this point that it already had the marker for resistance, so it was likely to have some resistance to the disease. So we kept it in for an extra season, into season 5, to see if it would show any symptoms at all, and it didn't. And it was planted, there was some other genotypes that also weren't showing symptoms that also had the marker, but Glen Moore had the fruit quality and the productivity that we were looking for, and the fruit size and picking efficiency that we wanted. So we put it forward for trials and have had good feedback since then. And so this year we named and released it as Glen Moore.
Thanks very much for that good bit of background there, Nikki. I'm hoping that's answered Martin's question and given other people who are interested to know on the background of Glen Moore's development, how that has come about and what the testing has been on that. We've got actually an array of questions from Fergus Duncan. I will pick one that, let's see what we'll go for. It's a general one, and so I can put this to the whole panel. Maybe they've all got different perspectives on it. Why is all supermarket soft fruit, more or less, and he says raspberries, strawberries, blueberries, why are they comparatively bland, relatively tasteless, and significantly less tasty than fruit from your local pick-your-own farm? Is it to do with shelf life and therefore profit over taste? What is the risk that over time the tasty varieties are actively selected out of the germplasm in favour of supermarket specials which taste of nothing but last for 6 weeks on a shelf? Oh, controversial question potentially there. Who would like to jump in to defend the supermarket varieties? I can see Nikki's unmuted her microphone.
Can I start?
Yes, sure.
Well, the fruit picked for retailers is generally picked at a very pink and underripe stage, so they can achieve the shelf life that the supermarkets want to get out of the fruit. It involves they want to extend the shelf life at least 7 days from picking to the pack house onto the supermarket shelves, and then a few days in somebody's fridge. And it's a big ask for a raspberry or a strawberry, so they're picked quite pink to achieve this. And they do ripen in the punnet slightly, but the flavour's not the same as if it's ripened on the plant. But the retailers would probably argue that extending the shelf life like this with pink fruit to begin with would help reduce food waste. Perhaps the answer is to select genotypes with a longer shelf life, which is certainly a major objective in the raspberry and blackberry breeding programs. Otherwise, I'm not sure another way around it, unless you shop more frequently at the retailers. But Susan was saying in her video that this year people are making less trips to the supermarket, and shelf life is even more important in fruit firmness. So perhaps it's down to us, the breeders, to achieve the shelf life along with the good flavour that we're also looking for. If anyone else has any comments.
Yeah, I totally agree with Nikki, and it is right. I mean, I think a lot of people have noticed that some of the supermarket bought fruit is tasting a little bit bland. I'm doing a lot of sensory studies this year in the blueberry breeding programme, and part of that is to analyse a range of our selections and cultivars that we're growing on site in Dundee, and we're also buying supermarket blueberries on a weekly basis, and we're tasting them. We're looking to see how consumers rate it on a 1 to 9 scale. 1 that absolutely hate it, 5 that neither like it or dislike it, and 9 that absolutely love it. And we're then looking at the sugars and the acids, the Brix and the acid balance, to see if we can then predict whether we think consumers are going to like it or not based on the Brix and the acid balance. And what we found in a lot of the supermarket blueberries is the Brix is very high. So, you know, they're getting sold as sweet berries because they are very high Brix, but the acid is very low. And I think, like Nikki's saying, it's a lot of that's down to the fruit just getting picked at a little bit earlier than it would have liked to have been, just so it can transport and store that a little bit better in the supermarket. So what we're doing as well is we're trying to understand a minimum maturity model. So that is following the Brix and the acid throughout the whole development stage. So we've been testing fruit at the green stage, all the way through to the fruit expansion, to the initial colouring, to the first blue, to the fully ripe, and then beyond. We're picking the fruit and scoring the bush depending on how ripe the rest of the bush is. So we'll pick fruit at 20%, the fruit's ripe on the bush, 40%, 60%, 80%, then 100% ripe. And we're looking to see how that affects the Brix and the acid. Because what we can do as breeders is when we're developing cultivars, if we understand this minimum maturity, when we're putting out our cultivars, we can then, you know, tell the growers that do not pick it until it is 60 or 80% ripe. Because sometimes the grower as well is having to pick fruit a little bit earlier, possibly down to labour. They have to pick fruit when they've got people on the farms. They're having to pick fruit sometimes when the weather is letting them do so, and they're having to pick fruit when the supermarkets are demanding it. But at least if we can, you know, help them by explaining the impact, the flavour, and potentially the money that they'll get for the berries by leaving it an extra week, how that'll affect the actual Brix and acid, how that'll affect the consumer's liking, then I think as breeders we can help in that process. But supermarkets are facing a very difficult job. People want to buy our fruit, or you know, soft fruit, throughout the year. So it's difficult for them to be able to make sure that they've got a sufficient supply. So they do have to import an awful lot. In terms of blueberries at the moment, less than 15% of what we consume in the UK is actually grown in the UK. So an awful lot of it is imported. And that means that it has to, you know, it takes a while for it to get here, then it has to last in the supermarkets. And the shelf life is so important. It doesn't matter if you've got the best tasting fruit, if it's soft, then consumers are not going to want it any more than they're going to want a bland one. So there's definitely things that breeders can do to help, and hopefully in our group we are working towards that.
Okay, thank you for that. I've got a question that came from a Hutton member of staff, and it's for Louise Gamble, our Honeyberry representative today. There are a few related questions actually. What kind of machine harvester is used to harvest honeyberries? Is it the same as a raspberry or blackcurrant harvester? And do you have to take the harvester over the same plants more than once? Are those plants susceptible to fungal diseases attacking wounds caused by damage from the machine harvester, such as is the case in machine harvested raspberries? Louise.
Thanks very much for the question. So the harvester we currently use for honeyberries is...
We'll lean forward a little bit, Louise. It's fading out. Thank you.
How is that now?
That's a bit better, thank you.
Right, okay. So for honeyberry we use a raspberry harvester, which does seem to harvest the honeyberry quite well. It could do with a few adaptations here and there, but we're still in the kind of early stages of ensuring that there could be some modifications on that harvester in the future. There are a very small amount of berries left after the harvester has went over the bushes. We're kind of looking at about 90 to 95% of berries being removed from the bushes once the harvester is passed over. We will obviously always have some amount of berries left that aren't just ready at that time, but not to an extent that we would then run over it a second time with a harvester. In terms of damage, so over the past 2 years that I've been monitoring the orchard, I haven't seen any mechanical damage as such to the bushes. They are quite hardy, and the leaf, probably in comparison to maybe raspberries or other soft fruits, are slightly different. They're a lot harder, a lot more waxier, and I think it's quite a generally sturdy bush. If there has been damage, it must have been quite special, as I haven't noticed it. But in saying that, in terms of fungal diseases, although honeyberry is known to be quite resistant to many pests and diseases, we have seen a couple of signs of mildew on some of the bushes, And again, this could be caused, as mentioned by the question, maybe the damage, so that is a possible, because it does coincide with the harvest of the season, and that coincides with the timing of mildew when the conditions are favourable for that disease. So that might be a possibility and something to look further into. So thanks very much for the questions.
Okay, I've just found out through checking some emails that there appears to have been problems quite widespread in people accessing the event. I've noticed that there are quite a small number of attendees at the moment, and there seems to have been issues with people getting into the event via the link that was sent. So it may be that we have to rely more on the recording than we had anticipated, unfortunately. I will then continue to relay the questions that we've had in advance. This is again from Fergus Duncan. What crops can have their seasonal lifestyle accelerated, amongst soft fruits that is? The film about accelerated germination cycles for blueberries is interesting, and I'm keen to know if the same process can be applied to any or all soft fruit. If not, why not? And is the process cost effective? So I guess Dylan, you have a little bit to say about that, but from the perspective of a non-soft fruit breeder, if you like. What about the other crop breeders that we have here? Nikki, what about raspberry, or Dorota, what about blackcurrant in this context potentially?
Yes, we're very keen to try raspberry seed germination in this environment also. And after watching Susan's video, realised that raspberries actually take less time to germinate. There's 3 to 4 weeks, which is a little bit shorter than blueberry, but raspberries also needs an acid treatment prior to sowing and germination, so that extends the time a little as well. So anything that will reduce the time to getting a small plant or an established plant would be very beneficial to the breeding programme, particularly useful for breeding primocane types, where you could probably get the plant to fruit in the same year that you germinate the seedling, based on our time scale for our breeding schedule. The other thing is we use a lot of molecular markers, or we have the potential to use a lot of molecular markers, many of which are in the process of validation at the moment. So as soon as we can germinate the seed, we can screen our seedlings for the marker, because we only need a small amount of leaf material for DNA extraction, and we can select plants at a slightly earlier stage then to take on to the next generation or to take to trials. So for raspberry, I'd be very keen to try it. Also in terms of high health propagation, where we could maybe take material from the high health house and propagate plants, have a clean source of plants to send either to trial or for bulking up for commercial propagation. That's another potential for it as well in raspberry.
What about blackcurrants, Dorota? Have you got any view or perspective on that?
Yeah, so the same applies for blackcurrants. We have done a small preliminary study outside of Liberty last year when we collected seed. So blackcurrant seed requires chilling between the harvest and germination. It's not as important for blueberry. So we wondered if we could germinate blackcurrant seed before they become dormant and before the accumulation of chill hours. We've tried that on a couple of existing varieties. One was more successful than the other one. So it seems like with blackcurrant it might take more of the trial and error, and perhaps we could fast track some of the breeding program. but maybe not all. You know, it depends which traits will be important, because we possibly wouldn't discard cultivar if it wouldn't germinate without chilling, if it had other important traits that we're interested in. However, we haven't tried that in Liberty's facility, and I'm very keen to do that. There are always novel crops that we try to breed, and potentially this technology will help us to establish new breeding programs much faster, because we have long established breeding programs going on now, and it's much more difficult to get into the same amount of germplasm and knowledge using traditional methods. So using novel technology would also help us to have a faster start, if you like, on the novel crops. Another point that is interesting for that is that we could breed or develop germplasm closer to their destination. There are people that would like to fund breeding programs in completely different countries and environments. Some of the traits might be very difficult to screen for in Scotland, for example. Those will be countries that require less chill or have completely different weather patterns. So we could actually operate in many more countries having this technology on site where there is the destination of those plants. So yeah, I'm very excited to see that, and I'll be looking to engage with Liberty Produce and look at some potential funding to take blackcurrants as the next species to go on that platform.
Okay, thanks very much for that. While we've been hearing the answers to that last question, I've attempted to send out a different access option for people who've indicated that they've had problems accessing the meeting via the main link, and we're starting to see some more people coming through now to that. So what I'll do is I will just pause for a second and see if there's anything coming in on the Q&A panel just now, and if not, then we can revert to another one of the questions that was asked in advance and see where we get to from there. Q&A, here we go. Well, we haven't got another question from the Q&A yet, so I'll revert to the list of things that were asked in advance. There's a question about whether is there any evidence that increasing climate change is causing different plant disease to become prevalent. Is there any forward-looking research into diseases which may be more relevant to climate change and which are not considered major problems at present? Who would like to give a view on that? I realise that you're fruit breeders rather than climatologists, but I know that you will probably have perspectives on diseases that have been and currently are providing challenge to growers. So have you seen any significant changes over the course of your time in the sector that may be down to climate change? How are things looking on that front?
Yeah, we're not plant pathologists, so it's difficult to say, but we can see with warming temperatures, this allows migration of new pests and perhaps intensification of diseases in our crops. So it's something that we're constantly reviewing. Julian, sorry, you're sharing.
Yeah, I realised that.
So it's something we are constantly reviewing in our objectives, in our breeding programs. It varies, obviously, but it's something to keep an eye on. Some problems may also disappear, for example, so it's not all bad news, but it obviously depends on the crop, where the crop is grown. It's also different in different parts of the UK. We have several trial sites, some in the south, some in the north here in Scotland, which is also correct for raspberry, and we see big differences. So it's something to be looked at and be very quick to react.
Okay, is there anybody else got a view on that one?
Can I add a bit to that?
Sure, Nikki.
Gillian? The AHDB have a pest and disease risk register which is updated regularly, and it weights risks on different pests and diseases of different crops, which is very useful for the breeding programmes. But we also maintain a broad range of germplasm within the breeding programmes, so we can select robust and resilient types that perhaps have resistance or tolerance to new or different pests and diseases, or old ones that come back sometimes also.
Okay.
So it's important to maintain diversity in your germplasm.
And presumably things that we're looking at in terms of variety development and things they're going into foreign markets for growth in other places where diseases and threats may be somewhat different from what we experience here as well. So there's a kind of an international perspective of necessity in all that as well. So our climate change, I guess, might be different from climate change in other places, potentially.
Yeah, it certainly is. And also even different production systems in different locations can throw up different pest and disease problems. And certainly in trials that we see in Spain and Portugal, we see pest and disease problems that we've never seen in the breeding trials here in the UK.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, moving back to the specifics of fruit breeding, let's say, there's a question here for Dorota specifically. The person is wanting to know, how do the traits and genetics vary, this would be in blackcurrant, depending on whether you're looking for fresh or processed blackcurrants? And how difficult is it to breed for climate resilient berries when the climate is so unpredictable at times?
Thank you. I will start from the first question.
Mm-hmm.
Fresh and processing blackcurrant, they differ quite a bit, although their roots come from the very similar plants. So by having those two breeding programs, we managed to differentiate between the germplasm, and we constantly selected genotypes that were more suitable for one or the other. So at the moment, several years on, we have quite a bit of separate germplasm that we will use only for fresh, for the reason of larger fruit or sweeter fruit, which is not a focus of the processing market. But we will also use a range of similar parentage, similar genetics that bring other important traits that are common for both programs and that are objectives in their agendas. And those include plant pest and disease resistance and yield, robustness of the vigor of the plant. So some genetics are very different and vary, and some are very common between them. And the traits, as I highlighted earlier, the large fruit, long streak, ease of picking, so more kind of fresh market traits are more important for the fresh market blackcurrant. And for processing one, it's more around the color, juice yield, yield in general, but also suitability for machine harvesting. So we need to make sure that plants are upright. They can keep upright all the yield that we're breeding for. They don't get too damaged after the machinery has been passed and harvested the crop, which is not as important in the fresh market because those plants will be grown in supported systems and perhaps in the tunnels as well. So also traits vary quite a bit. Moving on to the second question, On the climate resilience, yeah, we all witness a lot of events in the climate, if it's either very wet or very dry or windy, and we're all aware about very erratic and hectic weather patterns in the recent years. What all of those have in common, and what scientists around the world, including us, are working on, is looking at the what is underpinning all of that, and what are the models of the weather patterns. And the one thing that is consistent is the warming temperatures, and they especially affect blackcurrants in winters at the moment. So this is what we are breeding for, and this is what we can control. So we can control reducing the amount of chill that plants require in winter. Obviously, there will be other events, environmental events, that will affect the plants, but they will affect all the plants across. But we are concentrating on breeding resilient plants that will still deliver and grow and bring the economic yields to growers in the face of warming temperatures. So I hope that answers those questions.
A very full response there, Dorota. Thanks very much. I've got a question that was submitted earlier about honeyberries for Louise. The person says, you mentioned in the film that honeyberry will become popular in the future and that you're preparing for that. So what makes you so confident that it will become popular? And there's also a supplementary about, in terms of the grower perspective, what are the biggest threats to growing honeyberries in the UK, and are they prone to specific pests and diseases?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of why we kind of think they're going to be popular,
We're not.
Again, are you difficulty hearing me again?
That's a little bit better now, thanks.
Sorry, I'll just kind of come to sorry if I'm a wee bit too close. But, so we have done some market research online initially to see kind of what the public response was to the new berry coming onto the market and where it would be placed in terms of how people would consume this berry. And we received really good positive feedback on that initially. But the reason we're so confident is before COVID-19 restrictions, we were able to take advantage of many different public engagement events that the James Hutton attend. And during these events, we allowed the public to taste honeyberry, and we took feedback from them, and the response was just so positive. We had a likability of around about almost 80% of people liked them. When we asked if they would buy them, we had just over 70% score of people that would definitely buy them as well. So we've had really good response. They are grown in other countries such as Canada, Poland and Japan, and they are already commercially available out there. They are very versatile. They've just got really good benefits across the board in terms of nutrition as well. So we do have kind of evidence to back up why we see that they're going to become very popular in the future.
What's their shelf life like for the fresh berries?
For the fresh berries, so the cooperative, the project that I'm working on, they're really focused on the frozen at the moment, on the processing of the berry. In general, we haven't really done much work on the fresh produce yet. We would like to do that in the future. But as a kind of guide, you're looking at round about the same kind of shelf life as other berries in a kind of maintained cooler environment, a chilled environment. You would expect around about 7 days. Whereas that drops then obviously in more ambient temperatures like other soft berries. Was there another question at the end of that you had asked about pest and disease? Was that correct? You're muted, Gillian.
What's the susceptibility of honeyberry in the UK to specific pests and diseases or to general threats?
Yeah. So our main kind of problems happen at the very start of planting honeyberry. The young plants are a bit more susceptible, and we've seen populations of aphids on them. However, when the bush becomes established after 2 to 3 years, and after that period, they are a very kind of hardy, resilient, low input crop. They're known really for their low pest and disease susceptibility. We have seen small amounts of mildew on some of the varieties, but we're really in the stages of assessing varieties for all these different qualities that people are, all the breeders are talking about. So it's not just about how well they're growing and their susceptibility or resistance. It's also about the berry quality and the market each variety will go into. So we're still in the process of analysing this within the orchards. But in terms of pest and disease resistance, they are quite at a high level. The main culprits really for any sort of damage or loss of crop is really birds. They must have they've got a really good taste for this honeyberry as well and appreciate the flavour. But the growers are aware of this. They're implementing different deterrents to minimise this impact, and it's working pretty well so far. So
it's encouraging to hear. If we can switch the focus back to raspberries again, there's a question here for Nikki, and it's wanting to know, following on from the success with a marker for root rot, do you have any other markers that you're using within the raspberry programme?
Yes, thank you.
And are blackberries at risk from the same type of root rot that affects raspberries? The questioner continues.
Okay, well, to answer the second question first, thankfully, no, blackberries aren't susceptible to root rot. Well, Phytophthora rubi affects mainly red raspberry. Some hybrids like Loganberry, and sometimes black raspberry as well, but much less severe, but thankfully not blackberry. To answer your question about markers, we've been using the root rot marker routinely for several years, annually in the breeding programme. Julie Graham's group has identified and developed a whole suite of markers that are currently in validation and at various stages of deployment within the breeding programme. Alongside the marker for root rot, we're also using a phenotypic marker, GeneItch. It's the phenotypic marker means we take a characteristic that we can score or see in the glasshouse or the fields and correlate it to resistance. And in this case, we'll have the GeneItch, which gives the phenotype hairy canes, such as Glencairn. There's small hairs on the canes which make the plant feel like a little bit like a deer antler. It's not spines, it's small hairs, and this gives the plant resistance to cane botrytis and spur blight, which we can, instead of using a molecular marker, which would be more expensive to use in the lab, we can easily score this in the field and say whether or not the plant has resistance to cane botrytis or spur blight. Other molecular markers in the validation process, we've got markers for fruit size and post-harvest softening, which means we can identify types with a longer shelf life or eliminate types with a shorter shelf life. But these are a bit more less straightforward to validate, since these are traits that are affected more by environmental factors. Size and shelf life are affected by a whole load of surrounding factors, and including temperature and irrigation and feed. So that's taken a little bit longer than the root rot markers to validate, but we're almost at the end of that now. Julie's group's also identified markers for yield and yield components, which is very exciting, which we're working on validating at the moment. Also seasonality, fruit development and ripening, fruit colour, physical plant resistance traits, and the relatability to pest and disease resistance, such as leaf hairs, are correlated with aphid resistance, and plant architecture and habit, and how that relates to resistance and tolerance to various pests and diseases. So we've got a whole suite of markers that we're working on validation for, and depending on the industry, one or more of these traits will take priority. Like at the moment it's fruit size and shelf life, and next on the list is yield. So we do prioritise these depending on industry needs.
Thanks very much for that very thorough reply there. There's a question submitted for Susan, and I'm just hoping I'm going to read this out correctly. How has Power BI or BL or B1, I'm not sure which it is, changed the way you work?
It's Power BI, and it's absolutely redefined how I work, because it's given me so many different tools now and ways in which I can view and analyse my data that I didn't have before. Breeders and scientists and growers, we collect data every year, huge amounts of data. Every year we're trying to be consistent, we're trying to score the same traits so we can compare seasons. We also want to compare each of the different selections like for like. But for the most part, in most of the years that I've looked at, I've only ever then really had spreadsheets in which to then try and compare things. And it works to a fashion, but you can only ever, compare one trait at a time or one season at a time, and it was difficult. You used to, and again, I'm sure the breeders will agree with me, you used to have piles of spreadsheets, and you would have all these different files opened on your computer at the same time trying to see, I've got a selection that's doing really well this year. Has it always performed well, or has there been something this year that's made it perform better? And Power BI just gives you the tool to be able to analyse that data all in at the one time, and it lets you visualise it in ways that I'd never been able to do before. It's also changed the way going forward now that I collect my data. Because I know now how I can view it and how I can analyse it, it's made me think far more in advance of how I then want to collect it. Because some seasons I would go out with the same spreadsheet as I had the year before, looking to do things the same way. But I think now, seeing what I can actually do to visualise the data, I'm thinking about it in advance, and I think it's not just a straightforward scoring the bricks and comparing the bricks. I want to compare the bricks, but I also want to see how that's had an effect on fruit size. I want to see how fruit size has been affected by the irrigation or the temperature or the light levels. And Power BI gives me the means to do that. So it's been revolutionary for me. I only came across it this year.
Rewinding one step for those of us who aren't fruit breeders and who might not have come across Power BI in our daily labours, can you give us one or two sentences about what it is in case there are others equally as ignorant as myself?
Yeah, well, I was just as ignorant, 6 months ago. It's from Microsoft. It's free. It's a free reporting tool from Microsoft. It's just Power BI. You can get access to it, and you can get access to it. And all it is, it's not a database. It's a reporting tool, as it describes itself. And it lets you just upload your data. So it just gives you means to upload the spreadsheets that you're collecting year in, year out. You can upload any other format of data from Word documents, or if you use Microsoft Forms, if you get other people to collect data, it can use all your R scripts and all your fancy databases. You can upload everything onto Power BI, and it's a whole suite of ways to visualize that data. So it's free. I recommend everybody has a look at it. I've been part of the breeding program. We've had students that come in during the year to help us collect data, and one of these students was an IT guru. He was studying computer games and computer design at university, and every year he came in, I would show him the data and I'd say, how do I put it all together? How can I link all this and see how these selections are performing over the year? How can I look at it to see what's having an influence on size or flavour or shape or anything like that? And every year he would try and introduce me to some other database or some other format. And it was either too complicated for me to use, or it just didn't quite answer my questions. And then I think it was last year, he started working with Fife Council. Now, Fife Council gather information an awful lot more than the breeders do. So, I mean, I can't even imagine what the data looks like, but they've got data from all sorts of formats and from all across the whole of Fife. And they started to use this Power BI. And this was through their IT engineers, their IT support, introduced them to this and showed them how they can visualize and produce reports. So it lets you create dashboards that you can then share across any spectrum to let people access what's going on in finance or human resources or any element of the business really. And you can either give people access to add data and manipulate it, or they can just see a finalized report. And he contacted me and said, okay, I think I've found a tool now that will use your data. So I sent him a couple of spreadsheets. He spent 15, 20 minutes putting it all together, and honestly, it blew me away. So since the lockdown, every week I've had a Skype meeting with Stephen, and every week he's shown me a new way to visualize things and how to add data, and he's helped me to formulate plans and see how to use it. I mean, I really am blown away by it. I think.
Are you on commission now?
Well, not yet. No, I should be. I think I'll start up my own course. You can send me some of your data, and I can show you. Honestly, if you see what it does with one of your spreadsheets, I guarantee you, if you start using it, you won't go back.
Okay. Another question, which is possibly another, given that Power BI turns out to be a generic tool that any of us can apply to our field of activity. There's another generic question here. What are the biggest challenges that you face in any of the breeding programs? And that obviously goes across all the breeding soft fruit categories. Do you want to just have a go at this in turn? Who'd like to have a stab at the biggest challenges that you either individually or collectively face? Someone's bound to say budget, surely.
Shall I start?
Yeah, you go, Nikki.
I think what jumps to mind immediately is getting varieties out quickly that are also robust and predictable. We know how long it takes to breed new varieties, and it's a long, frustrating time scale. So we try and shorten this as much as possible with the use of markers or trialing in as many places as possible. But with shortened trialing times, or with less seasons data, we don't always have all the information we need about the variety. So I guess
speed breeding and things that help that could be a real boon in this regard if you can get around seasonality and stuff.
It certainly could, yeah. We always say that anything that shortens the breeding programme is a bonus, but we also have to have a look at new varieties or potential new varieties in terms of how easy they are to grow and how predictable they are to grow. To keep up with all the production systems that the growers have, and all the different climates and different situations that the growers have, and also retailer acceptance for fresh market fruit. We have to get the retailers on board, so they'll list them so that the growers can get on with growing them. So yeah, if I think of any more, I'll jump in.
Who's next? Who would like to vent their spleen about the biggest challenges that you face? What about COVID? Does anybody want to talk about the specifics of that?
I wanted to jump in on 2020 and complain about viruses here.
What virus is that, Dorota?
Yeah, in general, we have reversion virus, which is one of the problems in blackcurrant, but each of our crops has its own virus, I think, that we don't like particularly. So I think we need to recognize the need of more funding to support our breeding through research. Viruses, pest and disease, weed resistance, all those things. And the second thing will be, again, not directly linked to the breeding programs, but also to support British, because very often we breed for UK market. We do develop UK products that do indirectly fund our breeding locally, and obviously in the face of Brexit and everything else that is going on, it is important to recognize British fruit and pick it up in the supermarkets or buy the British brand juice to make sure that we can continue with the innovation and the government money can go to the research to underpin it.
And what about the ever controversial issue of genetic modification, and even specifically into the sort of gene editing end of things, which is maybe in some definitions falls short of genetic modification, but in the European classification it does come within that description. So we also have different approaches prevailing in UK legislature and Scottish territory around GM. So where are we with all that across the different soft fruit varieties that we work on?
So currently we're not using those methods in our breeding programs. They're interesting research tools and we admire them. We look into the newest advances in that. But at the moment, through the regulations and the legislations, we are not deploying them in our breeding programs.
Does anybody else want to pick up the generic question about what the biggest challenges are, and also the supplementary around any specific issues that COVID has brought with it in terms of research and breeding programs?
I'll just put in a little bit in terms of what I see the challenges in breeding, and an awful lot of that comes down to the environment. I mean, I totally agree with what Nikki and Dorot were saying with the issues that they'd raised, but the environment plays a huge challenge, and this is not just talking about climate change, it's just talking about yearly unpredictable weather events that we have that can make or break a season. And that's something that we try and monitor very closely. We try and mitigate it as best we can, but you can't always in Scotland predict the summer or do an awful lot about it. But it definitely has an impact on a lot of our selections, because we can have a selection that's done not very well in one particular year, and that might just be down to the environmental cues that it's had. It might kill the plant off completely if it ends up with a really hard frost. And for a lot of the breeding at the early stages, we only ever have one plant of each selection. So the environment can really be our enemy at times. Looking into the future, the fact that the James Hutton Institute will be hosting the Advanced Plant Growth Centre, that's something that we see as an incredibly positive thing that will affect the breeding programme. Because like what we've been doing in Liberty when we're looking at germination rates and seedlings, the Advanced Plant Growth is going to let us have a really good control of an awful lot of our seedlings. It's going to let us, as it was mentioned before, specifically look for selections specific for the environments or the countries that we're going to be grown in. We'll be able to grow bigger plants within that setting to then look at how extremes of temperature or chilling will have an effect on the fruit. So I think that's some way around the environmental problems that we have. We can take seedlings, we can throw anything that we want environmentally at them within these environments and see how they stand up.
So we're kind of using controlled environments increasingly to plan for uncontrollable events in the actual outside environment that we are growing in effectively.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in the same sense as well, whether it's in a smaller container or whether it's in a large advanced plant growth container, we can be looking at seedlings and we can then only select the seedlings that are most robust and most likely to be able to tolerate variations within the season. And then that way we're planting less seedlings into the field. At the moment when we do crosses, we're taking down, I think it was last year, I planted 1,800 new seedlings. knowing for a fact that, I'd be lucky if 10% of them are any good and will be moved forward into the next plot. But we don't have any other facility to monitor them yet, other than growing them up, putting them into pots, and then putting them outside. And then it's a case of you hope for the best. You wait and see what the season throws at it, and then you pick the strongest and the best selection from there. If we can do that internally, we can save an awful lot of time, effort, and money by reducing the amount of plants that we're then potting up into the field.
Okay, thanks for that, Susan. I had a note from Louise to say that she's struggling for battery, so I'll ask her that last question now, and we probably should think about drawing this session to a close shortly, as we've been at it for an hour for the Q&A. Louise, while your battery still has some life, what are your biggest challenges in terms of Honeyberry and how that all goes forward?
So because we're really at the early stages of this Honeyberry in Scotland, obviously our kind of biggest challenges are a kind of a combination of what everybody else is talking about here, and I think even for any breeder, there's always different challenges, and there may be one biggest challenge, but there is an awful lot of challenges, which I've noticed in terms of going with the environmental aspect of the challenges, and leading back to the pest and disease. Obviously, there's a lot of chemical treatments now that aren't environmentally friendly. There's going to be a lot of different chemicals that will no longer be used by farmers or allowed to be used. That the regulations have now changed. So there's more pressure on breeders now to obviously produce these varieties that will have more pest and disease resistant for growers. But in line with that, there is obviously the obstacle of making sure that the varieties that are resistant do have the correct type of berry that is suitable for the market. And my project really for the Honeyberry does do a lot of kind of market analysis and looking into different produce and where the Honeyberries can go. So yeah, the variety, the kind of challenge for Honeyberries is to one, ensure that we're picking the right varieties for optimal growth and optimal berries for Scotland, but also for the market that they decide to go into. So really it's about pleasing the public, pleasing the consumers, and I think the biggest challenge is the consumers, and kind of ensuring that we're providing something that they want, and obviously they'll buy from the growers.
Yeah, I guess that's the thing that everybody is in this for, is to make a living, to generate an economic benefit from the activity of growing whatever the soft fruits are that we're discussing. And if the customer ain't buying, the whole rest of the exercise becomes somewhat, ironically, fruitless. So maybe on that hideous pun, we can wrap things up here and remember that we're all striving to make people use more soft fruit, buy more soft fruit, want more soft fruit, because it's great and we're helping to make it greater. So thank you all for your contributions.